It was 6:12 a.m. on a Thursday when you checked your bank account. £23 and 17 pence. You stared at the number longer than you needed to. Not because it surprised you, because it didn't. The kettle clicked in the kitchen before the water even reached a full boil. You opened the dented coffee tin on the counter and shook it gently. Enough for one more cup. Maybe two if you stretched it. You chose one. You always chose one. Outside, the street was still wet from overnight rain. Cars rolled past with the quiet confidence of people already late for somewhere that paid them enough not to count every pound. Your work shoes sat beside the front door. The leather had cracked along the sides months ago. You polished them anyway. Some habits aren't about appearances. They're about dignity. As you tied the laces, you heard the washing machine stop. Your phone buzzed almost at the same moment. Electric bill due tomorrow. You locked the screen without opening the notification. There was no mystery inside it. You already knew the number. You already knew your account. The mathematics had been finished before the message arrived. You learned that kind of arithmetic long before you ever learned percentages. You learned it at a kitchen table where adults spoke in lowered voices. Not because they wanted privacy, because they wanted hope to survive another evening. You remember watching envelopes pile higher than birthday cards. You remember hearing phrases that sounded ordinary until you became old enough to understand them. We'll wait until payday. Maybe next month. Don't tell the kids. Money wasn't discussed. It hovered. Like weather. Always present. Always deciding what happened next. Birthdays became calculations. School trips became negotiations. Broken appliances became family meetings. You didn't think of your family as poor. You thought this was simply how adulthood worked. Everyone counted coins before filling the car. Everyone checked prices twice before putting something into the trolley. Everyone felt guilty buying something that wasn't necessary. At least, that's what you believed. Beliefs don't usually announce themselves. They disguise themselves as normal. By the time you reached your 20s, your relationship with money had become almost invisible. You weren't reckless. You weren't lazy. You paid your bills. You arrived early. You worked overtime whenever someone offered. You believed the formula was simple. Work harder. Earn a little more. Worry a little less. Yet somehow, the finish line kept moving. Every small raise disappeared before it arrived. The rent increased. Food became more expensive. Something always broke. A tire. A boiler. A tooth. You weren't climbing. You were running on a treadmill that politely pretended to be a staircase. The strange part wasn't that you struggled. The strange part was how ordinary struggling had become. You stopped asking why. You started asking how to survive the next month. There is a dangerous comfort in familiar pressure. If you've carried it long enough, you stop noticing the weight. You mistake exhaustion for adulthood, scarcity for responsibility, fear for wisdom. You thought money was something that happened to you, something your employer decided, something your postcode predicted, something your family had simply never been lucky enough to have. Without realizing it, you had inherited more than habits. You had inherited a ceiling, an invisible one. No one had built it on purpose. Your parents didn't wake up hoping to pass down financial anxiety. Their parents hadn't either. Each generation simply handed the next the beliefs that had once helped them survive. Keep your head down. Don't take risks. A secure job is everything. Rich people are different. Money changes people. Dreams are expensive. You accepted every sentence before you were old enough to question any of them. And when a belief feels like truth, you never think to look for the walls around it. That afternoon, during your lunch break, you sat alone on a weathered bench outside the warehouse with a homemade sandwich wrapped in foil. You watched people hurry past with takeaway coffees that cost almost as much as your lunch. Normally, you wouldn't have looked up. Normally, the break would have disappeared into your phone. But that day, someone sat beside you. An older man. Paint stains on his jacket. Mud on his boots. A notebook tucked under his arm. He wasn't dressed like success. He looked tired. Calm. Comfortable with silence. His phone rang. You weren't trying to listen. You simply couldn't avoid hearing him. No, he said. You don't need my permission. A pause. If the machine saves us 3 hours every week, buy it. Another pause. No, I'm not coming in. He smiled. You've got this. The call ended. He slipped the phone into his pocket, finished the last bite of his sandwich, and walked away. It lasted less than a minute. Nothing dramatic happened. No speech. No advice. No miracle. Yet something about those few sentences refused to leave your mind. Not what he said. What he didn't say. He never mentioned asking for overtime. He never mentioned requesting a shift. He never said a manager's name. It sounded as though work continued. Without him, that single observation unsettled you more than any motivational quote ever could. Because for the first time in your life, you saw a possibility you didn't have words for. Someone else was earning money, without trading every hour of their day for it. You went back inside when your break ended. The warehouse looked exactly the same. The fluorescent lights, the pallets, the conveyor belts, the clock on the wall. Nothing had changed, except one quiet question that refused to disappear. If everything you believed about money was true, who was that man talking to? And if everything you believed wasn't true, what else had you inherited without ever realizing it? The question followed you home. Not loudly, not urgently, just quietly enough that it never left. You reheated leftovers at 7:43 p.m., sat at the same small table, and opened your banking app again. £41 and 92 pence until next Friday. The numbers hadn't changed, but the way you looked at them had. For years, every problem had looked like an income problem. Now, another possibility had appeared. What if it wasn't only about how much you earned? What if it was about how money moved? The thought felt almost disloyal. You closed the app, opened your old laptop. The fan whined the moment it came to life, sounding older than it should have been. One hinge had snapped months earlier, so you balanced the screen with a folded receipt tucked beneath it. You typed 4 words. How do businesses make money? Thousands of results appeared. You expected complicated language. Instead, you found something almost unsettling in its simplicity. Businesses solved problems. Customers paid. The business kept operating, sometimes even while the owner slept. You frowned. That couldn't be the whole story, could it? The next evening, you searched again. Then again. One video became 3. 3 became 10. Not videos promising overnight wealth. Not people standing beside rented cars. You stopped watching those within minutes. They sounded like advertisements pretending to be advice. Instead, you searched for interviews. Factory owners, restaurant owners, software founders, people who spoke more about mistakes than victories. They used words you rarely heard growing up. Systems, cash flow, equity, assets, margins, recurring revenue. At first, they sounded like another language. So you bought a £4 and 50 pence notebook from the discount shop on your way home from work. On the first page, you wrote every unfamiliar word, one definition at a time. No shortcuts, no pretending you understood. You weren't chasing excitement. You were learning vocabulary. The notebook slowly became heavier than it looked. Not because of the paper, because every page challenged something you had believed your entire life. Growing up, money had always seemed like a reward. You worked. Someone paid you. The story ended there. Now you were discovering another version of the story. Money could buy time. Time could build systems. Systems could continue producing value. And value could create more money. Not magically, not automatically, but deliberately. That idea refused to leave your mind. One Saturday afternoon, you passed the small cafe where you usually bought the cheapest coffee in town. The owner stood outside repairing one of the outdoor tables himself. Customers continued walking inside. Staff continued serving drinks. The till continued ringing. He smiled as he tightened another bolt. Someone greeted him. Busy day? He laughed. Always. Then he added something almost absent-mindedly. The place works harder than I do now. He said it like someone commenting on the weather. No performance. No lesson. Just a sentence. But you carried it home. The place works harder than I do now. You repeated those words while washing dishes, while folding laundry, while waiting for the bus, until they stopped sounding impossible and started sounding practical. You began paying attention to things you had ignored before. The barber who owned 2 shops. The woman who stocked vending machines before sunrise. The couple who rented out equipment every weekend. The landlord replacing a broken lock. The bakery that sold the same loaf of bread hundreds of times every day. None of them looked extraordinary. None of them looked like the people you saw in glossy magazines. They looked ordinary. That surprised you more than anything. You had always imagined wealth arriving with noise. Instead, it seemed to arrive through repetition, through ownership, through patient systems built so gradually that outsiders mistook them for luck. At work, nothing changed. The warehouse still echoed with forklifts. Your lunch was still wrapped in foil. Your shoes still leaked when it rained. You still watched the clock crawl toward the end of every shift. Only now, you watch people differently. You noticed who owned the delivery company, Who maintained the vending machines? Who supplied the cleaning products? Who serviced the equipment? Every business around the warehouse suddenly became visible. Before, you had only seen jobs. Now you saw ecosystems. One company paying another, another paying another. Money moving in circles you had never noticed because you had always stood in only one place. You didn't envy them. Not yet. You simply became curious. Curiosity has a strange effect on fear. It doesn't eliminate it. It quietly replaces it. Instead of asking, "Why am I always behind?" you began asking, "How does this actually work?" Late nights became normal. At 11:18 p.m., your apartment was silent except for the hum of the laptop and the occasional creak from the radiator. You copied diagrams into your notebook, crossed them out, drew them again. You learned the difference between spending and investing, not as a promise of bigger returns, but as two entirely different conversations with your future self. You learned that an expense disappears. An asset, when chosen well, continues to create value. The idea wasn't glamorous. It was almost boring. And somehow, that made you trust it more. One evening, your phone rang. It was your mother. "Are you still working?" "No." "What are you doing then?" You looked around the room. The notebook, the laptop, 3 library books stacked beside the kettle. You smiled. "Studying." There was a pause. "For what?" You opened your mouth, then closed it again. You didn't know how to answer. Because you weren't studying for a qualification, or an interview, or a promotion. You were studying a world you hadn't known existed. "I'm just trying to understand money." She laughed softly. "I thought everyone understood money." You looked down at the notebook. So did you? Until you realized almost everyone only understands the part they're taught. That night, before you went to bed, you turned back to the first page of the notebook. The list of unfamiliar words looked smaller now. Some had become familiar. Others still confused you. But something had already changed. You no longer believed money was simply something handed to people by employers. It could be organized, directed, protected, built. Not quickly, not easily, but intentionally. You closed the notebook, switched off the light, and for the first time in years, you weren't wondering how to survive next month. You were wondering what you might be capable of building over the next 10 years. The answer would begin with a decision so small it almost felt insignificant, and it would cost you far more than you expected. The first thing you built didn't look like the beginning of a new life. It looked like another expense. It was £1,480, almost everything you had managed to save over 19 months. You transferred the money on a Tuesday at 8:54 p.m. Your finger hovered over the button longer than the bank needed to process the payment. You weren't afraid of losing the money. You were afraid of proving every warning you had ever heard was right. Don't risk what you can't replace. People like us can't afford mistakes. Play it safe. You pressed confirm anyway. The screen refreshed. Your balance dropped. The room became very quiet. Nothing happened. No dramatic music. No feeling of transformation. Just a smaller number in your account and a question that refused to leave. What have you just done? For weeks, you worked before sunrise. You worked your regular job. Then you came home and worked again. Your dinner often went cold beside your laptop. The coffee tin emptied faster than usual. Your notebook filled with crossed-out ideas. Every evening ended with one more adjustment, one more email, one more problem to solve. You weren't trying to become wealthy. You were trying to become someone who created value instead of only selling hours. At first, progress looked invisible. Then it looked promising. A few strangers noticed your work. A handful became customers. The first payment arrived. £37.40. You smiled. Not because of the amount. Because someone had chosen something you had made. It felt different from a wage. A wage arrived because you had been present. This arrived because something you built had been useful. You wrote the number in your notebook, circled it, and kept going. Then everything slowed. Customers stopped appearing. The small momentum disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. You changed prices, changed descriptions, changed your schedule. Nothing seemed to matter. You refreshed the screen every few minutes. Still nothing. You began waking in the middle of the night. Not because of noise, because of silence. Silence where progress had been. 3 months later, another payment left your account. Software, equipment, supplies, small costs that had seemed manageable on their own. Together, they became heavy. One Friday evening, you opened your banking app. £212.63. That was all that remained. You sat on the edge of your bed. The same bed, the same room, the same cracked wardrobe, the same old laptop balanced on the same folded receipt. Only now, the receipt had started to tear. You laughed, not because anything was funny, because sometimes disappointment arrives so quietly that laughter is the only sound it leaves behind. A week later, you admitted it. The first attempt had failed. When you added everything together, you had lost 1,263 pounds and 58 pence. It wasn't enough money to ruin your life, but it was enough to convince the old version of you that this was exactly why people stayed safe. At work the following Monday, someone asked why you looked tired. Just busy. You smiled. The conversation ended. Nobody knew what had happened. Nobody knew what the numbers had cost you. Embarrassment has a way of making failure feel private. You didn't tell your family. You didn't tell your friends. You simply returned to work, picked up another pallet, clocked in, clocked out. From the outside, nothing had changed, but something had. You noticed it a few weeks later. You stopped saying, "I hope this works." You started asking, "Why didn't it work?" It sounded like a small difference. It wasn't. Hope waits. Questions investigate. For the first time, failure became information instead of identity. You opened the notebook again, not to mourn the loss, to examine it. Every page became evidence. Every mistake received a reason. You hadn't understood your customers well enough. You had underestimated your costs. You had assumed people would simply notice what you built. You confused creating something with learning how to reach the people who needed it. Pain has terrible timing, but excellent memory. You never repeated those mistakes. Not because you were smarter, because they had become too expensive to forget. Months passed, then another year, then another. No dramatic leap interrupted the routine. Real change almost never announces itself. Every weekday began at 5:48 a.m. The alarm sounded. You reached for the same phone, put on the same work shoes, walked through the same warehouse doors. The fluorescent lights still buzzed overhead. The conveyor belts still rattled. The clock still seemed slower after lunch. Nothing about your environment suggested transformation, but your evenings belonged to someone else now. The person who came home after work wasn't trying to escape anymore. They were trying to improve. One page, one lesson, one conversation, one small experiment. Again and again, your notebook multiplied. 1 became 3. 3 became 7. Shelves that once held random clutter slowly filled with folders labeled in careful handwriting. Ideas, mistakes, expenses, observations, questions. You became strangely fascinated by ordinary things. Why one small shop stayed busy while another closed. Why people trusted certain brands. Why some businesses survived recessions. Why others disappeared after one difficult season. You stopped looking for secrets. You started looking for patterns. Nobody applauded this version of you. Nobody called to congratulate you on another evening spent learning. Nobody noticed that your weekends had quietly changed. While others measured progress by promotions or holidays, you measured it by understanding. The room still looked almost identical. The laptop was older. The desk had more scratches. The coffee tin had been replaced after the lid finally broke. The object changed. The habit didn't. Sometimes doubt returned. Usually around midnight. Usually when you compared yourself to people who seemed years ahead. You wondered whether they had started younger, known more, been luckier. Then you looked around the room. Everything important had happened inside it. Not success. Preparation. Preparation is difficult to celebrate because it looks exactly like repetition. You were still unknown, still underpaid, still waking before sunrise, still carrying boxes for someone else's business. Anyone looking at your life would have assumed nothing was changing. They would have been completely wrong, because without noticing, you had already escaped the most dangerous part of the ceiling. You no longer believed your future would arrive by accident. You believed it would be built, piece by piece, even if nobody else could see the structure yet. Then one ordinary morning, after years of invisible work, a number appeared on your screen that changed nothing about the room, and everything about your future. It happened on a Monday at 9:07 a.m. You almost missed it. The warehouse was louder than usual. A forklift reversed nearby. Someone dropped a pallet across the loading bay. Your phone vibrated inside your pocket. You expected another delivery notification, another bill, another reminder that needed attention after work. Instead, you saw an email. Payment received. You opened it without thinking. Then you looked again. 4,862 pounds and 31 pence. You checked the sender. You checked the amount. You checked your bank account. The number was real. You didn't celebrate. You didn't even smile. You simply stood there while the noise around you continued exactly as before. Someone called your name from the other end of the warehouse. You answered automatically. Your shift wasn't over. Neither was your life. The number changed. The room didn't. And somehow, that told you everything. For years, you had imagined success arriving like a door swinging open. Instead, it arrived like a receipt. Quiet, ordinary, easy to overlook. That evening, you sat at the same kitchen table where so many evenings had ended in uncertainty. The coffee tin was still there. The old notebook sat beside it, its corners softened by years of being opened and closed. You turned back to the first page. The definitions looked almost childish now. Cash flow, assets, ownership. You smiled for the first time that day, not because you had finally understood every word, because you had lived long enough to watch those words become part of your life. The payment wasn't enough to change everything, but it was enough to prove something. The system worked. Not perfectly, not consistently, but it worked. The next morning, you still woke at 5:48 a.m. You still tied the same work shoes. You still drove the same route. You still packed your lunch in the same reusable container. Nothing outside your life suggested that anything had changed. Inside your mind, everything had. Because doubt could no longer say, maybe this is impossible. Now it had to say, can you do it again? That question became your new challenge. The first success felt exciting. The second required discipline. Over the following months, you resisted the urge to celebrate too early. You remembered the first failure. You remembered how quickly momentum could disappear. So instead of spending the money, you built with it. You replaced equipment that had slowed you down. You improved processes that had once depended entirely on your time. You kept careful records. Every expense had a purpose. Every decision had a reason. The notebook changed again. Its pages no longer held only questions. Now they held measurements. How long tasks required. Which efforts produced results. Where money quietly disappeared. Where it quietly multiplied. The work became less emotional. More deliberate. You stopped chasing busy days. You started building useful ones. Then, 18 months later, another milestone arrived. Your business earned just over £82,000 in a year. When you first saw the total, you expected to feel different. You expected relief, confidence, some permanent feeling that you had finally made it. Instead, you felt responsibility. Because numbers create options, and options create decisions. You realized something that no spreadsheet could have prepared you for. Earning money and managing money were two different skills. When your account balance grew, so did your mistakes. Small decisions became expensive. One poor hire cost weeks of progress. A rushed purchase sat unused in the corner of the room. An agreement made too quickly became months of unnecessary stress. You had escaped scarcity. Now you had to escape carelessness. No one had warned you about that. Growing up, you imagined that having money meant having fewer problems. The truth was quieter. Some problems disappeared. You no longer checked your account before buying groceries. You no longer postponed replacing worn-out shoes. The electric bill no longer felt like a threat. But new questions appeared. Who can you trust? What should you say no to? When do you stop working? How much is enough? Those questions couldn't be answered by earning another pound. They required becoming a different person. You noticed it in ordinary moments. Walking through a supermarket without calculating every item. Booking a train ticket without waiting for payday. Replacing a broken kettle the same day it stopped working. To anyone else, these looked insignificant. To you, they felt extraordinary. Because freedom rarely announces itself through luxury. It announces itself through the absence of fear. One evening, your mother visited. She opened your cupboard to make tea. You've got proper coffee now, she laughed. You looked at the shelf. The old coffee tin was still there. You had never thrown it away. It no longer held coffee. It held receipts. The earliest invoices. The first notebook. A folded printout of that £4,862.31 payment. She picked up the tin. You still keep this? You nodded. It reminds me. Of what? You thought for a moment. That the hardest part wasn't learning how to earn more. It was learning that I wasn't trapped. She looked at you for a long second, then quietly placed the tin back on the shelf. Neither of you said anything else. Some conversations don't need more words. As the months became years, your work continued to grow. Not explosively, gradually, predictably, exactly the way you had hoped. People began asking how you had become successful. They assumed there had been one decision, one opportunity, one lucky break. You almost laughed every time, because they were looking at the harvest, not the years spent preparing the soil. And just when you began to feel comfortable carrying the weight of success, you discovered that the heaviest cost wasn't financial at all. It was the distance growing quietly between you and the people who remembered the person you used to be. You returned to the street where you grew up on a Sunday afternoon at 3:26 p.m. Nothing looked different. The brick houses were the same. The bus stop still leaned slightly to one side. The corner shop still displayed handwritten offers in the window. Even the pavement carried the same cracks you remembered stepping over as a child. You parked a few streets away and walked the rest of the distance. Not because there was nowhere to park, because you wanted to arrive slowly. Memory has its own pace. The front gardens were smaller than you remembered. The road seemed quieter. The place that had once felt like the entire world now fit into a single glance. You smiled. Then you realized something uncomfortable. You recognized every corner. But you no longer recognized the person who had once believed this was all life could become. That thought brought no pride, only gratitude, and a strange kind of grief. Later that week, you met two old friends at the same pub where you had spent countless Friday evenings after work. The tables hadn't changed. Neither had the faded carpet. The same football match played silently on the television above the bar. One of them laughed as you walked in. "Look who finally remembered us." You smiled. "I've been busy." "We know." The sentence sounded harmless, but something underneath it wasn't. For the first half hour, everything felt familiar. Stories, jokes, memories. The conversation moved easily between old jobs, old mistakes, and people you hadn't thought about in years. Then one of them asked, "So, how's business?" You answered honestly, "It's going well." "Busy?" "Very." He nodded. Another friend leaned back in his chair. "Must be nice." The words weren't cruel. They were heavy. You searched for a response that wouldn't create more distance. It took longer than it looks. He shrugged. "Still, you got out." Silence settled over the table. Not awkward, just truthful, because part of you knew exactly what he meant. You had left the routine you once shared. Your conversations had changed. Your priorities had changed. Even your questions had changed. Years earlier, you would have spent the evening complaining about work. Now you found yourself thinking about systems, customers, hiring, responsibility. You weren't trying to sound different. You simply were. When you left the pub, one of them called after you. "Don't become one of those rich people." You turned around. "What does that mean?" He laughed. "You know? Forgetting where you came from." The word stayed with you all the way home. Could someone remember where they came from and still choose not to live there again? You weren't rejecting your past. You were refusing to repeat it. There was a difference. Not everyone could see it. Family became more complicated too. Not because anyone stopped loving you. Because money changes conversations long before it changes people. At a family dinner, your uncle looked across the table. "So, you're doing all right now?" "I can't complain." He smiled. "Must be nice not worrying about bills anymore." You paused. "I still worry." He laughed. "No, you don't." You wanted to explain. You wanted to tell him that financial fear doesn't disappear the day your income changes. It simply changes shape. You still worried. About employees depending on you. About making the wrong decisions. About protecting what had taken years to build. But those worries sounded invisible to someone who had spent decades wondering how to make next month's rent. So you simply nodded. The conversation moved on. Sometimes silence preserves relationships better than explanations. As your work grew, your calendar filled. Invitations became decisions. Every yes quietly became 10 hidden no's. You missed birthdays. Arrived late to family gatherings. Left early from celebrations because something unexpected required your attention. Not because you valued work more than people. Because responsibility rarely asks permission before arriving. One evening, your mother visited again. She noticed the notebook still sitting on the shelf. "You still write everything down?" "Every day." She smiled. "You always did like making lists." You laughed. "It isn't really about lists anymore." "What's it about?" You looked at the notebook for a long moment. "It helps me remember who I'm becoming." She nodded slowly. Then she asked something that caught you off guard. "Are you happy?" You didn't answer immediately. Instead, you looked around the room. The same small apartment. A slightly better desk. A newer laptop. Books where clutter used to be. The old coffee tin still sitting quietly on the shelf. You thought about the warehouse. The late nights. The years nobody noticed. The first failure. The first payment. The conversations that had become harder. The friendships that had become quieter. Finally, you answered. I'm peaceful. She smiled. I hoped you'd say that. Peace. Not excitement. Not endless ambition. Peace. Growing up, you thought success would feel loud. Instead, it sounded like fewer sleepless nights. Like buying groceries without checking the account first. Like fixing something before it became an emergency. Like choosing your time more often than someone else chose it for you. Freedom wasn't dramatic. It was deeply ordinary. Still, there were moments when loneliness appeared without warning. You would walk through your old neighborhood and realize you were a visitor. You would sit in rooms where nobody understood the decisions keeping you awake. You would attend business events where nobody understood the person you used to be. For a while, you belonged completely to neither world. And perhaps that was always the price of crossing an invisible ceiling. You don't stop loving the place that shaped you. You simply outgrow the beliefs that kept you there. Years earlier, that thought would have frightened you. Now, it quietly prepared you for the final lesson. Because eventually, you would understand that none of this had ever been about your own success. It had always been about the people who would come after you. 14 years passed. Not in a blur. Not in a montage. One ordinary day after another. One conversation. One mistake. One decision. One quiet improvement. If someone had asked you to name the moment your life changed forever, you wouldn't have been able to. Transformation rarely arrives all at once. It settles into your habits until one day your habits become your identity. It was 8:18 p.m. on a Wednesday when you looked around the dining room. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Dinner plates sat scattered across the table. Someone laughed in the kitchen. Someone else was drying dishes. The room wasn't large. The furniture didn't match perfectly. One chair still creaked whenever someone leaned back. You had promised yourself years ago that you would replace it. You never did. It reminded you that comfort and perfection had never been the same thing. Your phone rested face down beside your plate. Earlier that afternoon, your accountant had sent the year's figures. You opened the email again. Net worth, £3,412,870. Years ago, that number would have felt impossible. Now, it felt strangely quiet. You closed the email. No one else at the table knew you had looked. No one asked. No one needed to. Because the most meaningful thing in the room wasn't on the screen. It was sitting across from you. Dinner continued. Someone asked for more potatoes. Someone joked about burning the garlic bread. The dishwasher beeped. Life carried on. And somehow, that ordinary evening became the richest moment you had ever lived. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, you walked into the kitchen. The house was silent. You opened the cupboard above the kettle. The old coffee tin was still there. The paint had faded. The lid didn't close properly anymore. You carried it to the table. Inside, nothing had been thrown away. The first notebook. The folded receipt that once held up your broken laptop. The invoice for £1,480. The investment that had ended in failure. The bank statement showing £23.17 on that Thursday morning. The printout of the first payment. A pair of worn boot laces you never found the heart to discard. None of it had financial value anymore. But every object carried a belief you had outgrown. You spread everything across the table. It looked less like a collection of possessions, and more like evidence. Evidence that your life had not been transformed by one opportunity, or one brilliant idea, or one lucky break. It had been transformed by thousands of ordinary decisions no one had applauded. You remembered the warehouse, the fluorescent lights, the endless shifts, the late nights with the old laptop humming beside a cup of cheap coffee. You remembered losing £1,263.58 and wondering if everyone had been right about people like you. You remembered the years when progress existed only inside notebooks. The years when the room never changed. Even though you did. You finally understood something that had taken more than a decade to learn. Poverty had never been only about numbers. It had been about inherited expectations. About believing your future had already been negotiated by your past. About confusing familiarity with destiny. The invisible ceiling had never been made of money. It had been made of stories. Stories whispered across generations. Be grateful for what you have. Don't risk too much. People like us don't do that. Some of those stories had protected your family when they had no other choice. You didn't resent them. You honored them. Survival deserves respect. But survival was never supposed to become inheritance. That was the difference. You weren't trying to erase where you came from. You were trying to ensure the next generation wouldn't mistake limitation for identity. You looked once more at the bank statement, showing £23 and 17 pence. The number seemed impossibly small now. Yet you realized something that surprised you. You felt just as much compassion for that version of yourself as pride. Because that person had kept showing up, kept asking questions, kept learning, kept building. Even when no one else could see the construction. You placed everything carefully back into the coffee tin, closed the lid as best you could, and returned it to the cupboard, not as a reminder of hardship, as proof that ceilings can be inherited, and they can also end. Tomorrow morning, another child in another home would wake up to a parent quietly counting coins before breakfast. Another family would postpone replacing worn-out shoes. Another person would believe that working harder was the only way money could ever arrive. You couldn't rewrite every story, but you had rewritten one, your own. And because you did, someone sitting around your table years from now would inherit something your younger self never received. Not wealth, not comfort, not certainty. Permission. Permission to question invisible limits. Permission to believe that ownership can be learned. Permission to understand that money is a tool, not an identity. Permission to build instead of merely endure. The account balance had changed. The house had changed. The years had changed. But the greatest victory had nothing to do with numbers. You were born beneath a ceiling you didn't build. You simply refused to pass it on.